Focus for today is going to be Black Life in Entertainment, post 1970. At the end of this session, you want to be able to define the terms here. For any required sources, you want to use the source worksheet. And then for all of the clips and sources we will look at, you want to answer these two questions, which will be used for a discussion. We're going to start off first with movies. We want to recap from Unit 3, the section on entertainment, where we looked at Step and Fetch It and movies during the 1920s that used white actors to portray black characters like Al Jolson, and the iconic image from the 1800s of Jim Crow. So we want to go back to this idea of how they see us, because for the most part, the issue is going to emerge once again. You're going to have different actors, actresses, and writers and producers trying to challenge the way African Americans are portrayed in cinema, television, and other sources of entertainment. We already talked about Step and Fetch It, this individual here who had to take whatever roles were given to him, and that is going to be a common theme. As it says down here, he was a comedian, film actor of Jamaican and Bahamian descent. Oscar Micheaux is in the AP framework, so we want to treat this like a definition. And in the 1920s, 1940s, produced a series of films, and his films tried to have a black cast. And with that black cast, they could challenge negative stereotypes, as we addressed in prior classes. On this slide, we have a collection of posters for his work. And when I think about these questions, what issues have not changed as you review the source and images? And the sources we're going to look at are the ones here. And then this question is going to come up. Do minority shows have an obligation to address issues impacting minority groups? And this could be for any minority group, but for now we're talking primarily about African Americans. So we are going to take a look at this trailer and then this brief documentary clip on Oscar Micheaux. This is a required source in the AP framework, and it is a lobby card. A lobby card would be a card that you can get prior to viewing the movie that you were going to see. So if you went in to see The Betrayal, this lobby card, you might be lucky enough to acquire this as somebody going to watch this particular film. We're going to revisit this slide from Unit 3. In that slide, we were introduced to the film Hollywood Shuffle. This is the trailer for that particular piece. And if you're not familiar, Robert Townsend, who was a comedian and actor, was unable to attract any sort of production money to make this film, which was about struggling black actors and actresses in the 1980s. And he decided that he was going to fund the film himself. And in that film, he hired a black cast consisting of numerous black comedians who would later go on to have successful careers. In scene 2, it is a comedy skit about black acting school. In scene 3, he is being told by a director to act more black. We've also included a clip of Seinfeld. In this clip, they're referencing Al Jolson and the Good Times intro, which we watch, and we'll be looking at that again, as well as the current Netflix version that premiered in 2024. We want to come back to these two questions. What issues have not changed as you review the source and images? So we think about the 1920s, 1940s, and 50 films, and you're kind of stuck with the same issue in the 1980s, where you're seeing black actors and actresses given certain roles, which is the primary reason why this clip, Black Acting School, exists. And do minority shows have an obligation to address issues impacting minority groups? Hollywood Shuffle is a film that is addressing what it's like to be a struggling black actor. So they are definitely answering question number 2 with that film. In the 1970s, a genre of film would come out called blaxploitation films, and blaxploitation films were not necessarily films that were produced always by black producers and writers and directors. These were many times white producers or white writers and directors who were making films about what they believed life was like in urban America. This movie here, The Thing with Two Heads, which oddly enough has the soundtrack, the Apache song, by the Incredible Bongo Band, But the thing with two heads, we're going to take a look at this trailer here. I think it's kind of self-explanatory when you're thinking about blaxploitation. These are a series of films that always portrayed African American culture and environments as one just filled with crime, prostitution, and with no role models other than a criminal type role model. Another example of a blaxploitation film would be the movie The Mack. And the reason why I'm including the movie The Mack is because this movie was filmed in Oakland and it was under criticism as the Black Panther Party, led by Huey Newton, tried to shut it down because of its portrayal of African American criminals. One thing about the end result of that film is that the writers and directors opted to make the main character's brother a follower of the Black Panther Party. So there are a lot of scenes in there, like this one here, that addresses ideas of black nationalism and black responsibility. Another one would be the Kofi trailer from 1973. This is a movie with the star Pam Grier. African American women were sexualized in blaxploitation films, as you can see by the poster alone. And these are two examples of films where black actors were struggling to get any sort of role that was anything other than playing a criminal, a drug dealer, or something violent. Hence the term blaxploitation. You always want to keep in mind that the movie industry is controlled at this point by white America. That whatever roles are going to be out there for black actors and actresses is going to be very limiting, and some of those authentic stories will not be told, which is why the black theater, as a result of the Great Migration, was significant to try to get a different voice, to try to, bring out into the mainstream ideas of what it's like to be a black American. Otherwise, you will be subjected to images like the two we see here. Question: would Hollywood producers allow honest black stories? That is the question as we transition to television shows. We're going to be looking at some of these television shows. I'm questioning why they did not include The Cosby Show. I guess that is a result of Bill Cosby and some of the charges that have been brought against him as of recent. We're going to transition to television. The first show we're going to look at is The Jeffersons, which aired for 11 seasons. So what I did is I've placed the intro and I've identified two significant episodes. George's Family Tree. In George's Family Tree, he believes he's African royalty. This is a Christmas episode, and in this Christmas episode, you learn that the main character, George Jefferson, who is someone of the black middle class, is struggling with being black and rich versus being poor and forgetting about the community where he had come from. So go back to these questions. What issues have not changed as you review the sources and images? The images we're looking at are the links. And then the question again, do minority shows have an obligation to address issues impacting minority groups? Obviously, these two episodes do precisely what question 2 is addressing. We transition to Good Times, the original Good Times. The introduction shows you screenshots of Cabrini Green in Chicago. We're going to be looking at 2 episodes. This first one, Michael Gets Suspended, where he talks about his desire to learn more black history, which is part of what the Black Panther Party was trying to argue, as well as other movements going back to the 1920s and 1930s. In this clip here, it's about Black Jesus, questioning whether or not Jesus was black. One thing to point out is that the father was written out of the show after he complained to writers about the negative portrayal of black characters. One in particular was this individual, Jimmy Walker, played the role of JJ, and he was usually portrayed as a buffoon, which is why the father wanted a more positive portrayal. So we're going back to these questions here. What issues have not changed as you review the sources and images? And then the question about the obligation that minority groups have to make shows about issues impacting their situation in America, or can they just make a show in general? As we transition to Sanford and Son, Red Fox right here is a popular comedian in the 60s and 70s. and he made a show, Sanford & Son. And in this show, he played the role of a junkyard owner in Watts, California. And in this episode, Lamont Goes African. The main character, or the father, is questioning why his son is focusing on being African. And then another famous episode, Fred in Court, where on national TV, he flat out uses the N-word. So we want to go back to these two questions here. Another show which was based off of a movie, Cooley High, is the movie. The TV show is What's Happening. This is about 3 teenagers living in California. And Cooley High is a popular film. It's in the historic registry. Here is the trailer. And they tried to base What's Happening off of the show. And they really didn't want to address any issues. They just wanted to show what it was like to be a teenager, which is why the episode is basically about a party. This one, the main character was a dancer, and this clip right here shows a series of his dance moves. And they really did not address too many issues, but just like in Good Times, the mother was written out by the second season. After the second season, once again concerned about the positive portrayal about African Americans. Once again, we're back to those two questions. One show that is not in the framework is The Cosby Show. It's possibly a result of the main character, Bill Cosby, with some of the allegations against him as of recent. But The Cosby Show is significant because in the 1980s it showed a black middle class family, and they dealt with some of the same issues. Should they always address black issues, or can they just make a show about a family going about their lives? The episodes that I selected is this one here, which shows the Jitterbug Dance, a popular African-American dance style from the 40s. And then this one here, where the entire family is singing and dancing, because when this episode aired, it definitely changed the perception of white America as something to have been talked about. Also going to point out that Bill Cosby did have a cartoon show called The Fat Albert Show, and this was more of a inner city cartoon trying to educate African American children and expose non-African Americans to what it potentially might be like to be black living in Philadelphia. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is in the AP framework. We're going to watch the intro, and then I've selected these two episodes here because in this episode, Carlton, one of the main characters, his blackness is being questioned, as well as in this one where the Fresh Prince is accusing his uncle of selling out. And then the uncle gets upset and talks about his experience with reading and hearing Malcolm X. So once again, we're going back to these two questions here. What issues have not changed? And do minority shows have any obligation to address such issues? The final series that is in the AP framework is the TV show Blackish. And this show has a upper middle class family. And the two episodes that I've selected, Juneteenth and Bo Ratio, which addressed colorism. And the Juneteenth episode, because prior to this episode airing, there really didn't seem to be much awareness of Juneteenth. It was not until after this episode aired that national attention to Juneteenth started in the United States. A transition to comedy. Here we're looking at two comedians, Nipsey Russell and Moms Mabley, 1948 and 1967. These two links will take you to those two sets. And the question here is pretty much going to be the same. As comedians, do they have an obligation to address issues impacting their particular group? And what issues have not changed? As a black comedian, is a white audience going to get all of the jokes? And at what point does the black comedian have to modify the joke and the punchline to appeal to that audience? What's going to happen when you are in a situation where it's more of an integrated audience and the comedian has to be aware of those dynamics? For more information on black comedy, take a look at the documentary Right to Offend. That documentary will introduce you to all of these comedians and how they dealt with such questions. This one in particular, what is the dilemma of being too black? The additional questions we want to think about here is what are the expectations of being famous and black? Is there a hidden rule that says you have an obligation to address racial issues in America? And if you do not address racial issues, at what point will you be considered a sellout? And I use these three examples down here. MC Hammer, who had crossed over once he had gained too many white listeners, and there was a feeling that his music was no longer black. The sad part about his story is that this individual made it a point to hire numerous people in his community, ultimately led to him going bankrupt. O.J. Simpson, in one of his famous quotes, "I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm O.J." And he was definitely criticized for not doing enough for the black community. Michael Jordan, who had made a statement, Republicans buy sneakers too, which means he's not going to go out there and make any political statements because that might lead to a loss of revenue. So on some level, all of the black comedians, actors, singers are going to have to deal with this issue, whether we're talking about Sam Cooke or we're talking about the father in the TV show Good Times, John Amos. The minute you start complaining about having too many issues that are harmful to your community, you run the risk of losing employment. The last TV show will be In Living Color. This is a sketch comedy show that ran for 5 seasons and led to the success of numerous comedians, the Wayans brothers, Jennifer Lopez, Jim Carrey. So I selected 2 clips here. Homie Don't Play That, as well as this one with Jim Carrey mocking a white rapper, Vanilla Ice. And once again, we're back to these 2 questions. Music and TV. This is the story of Soul Train. This is a required image from the AP framework. Soul Train was a black response to the show American Bandstand. If we click this link, it'll talk a little bit about the Beatles. As we look at this audience here, we pretty much see a all-white audience. An American Bandstand was a way to introduce teens to music, rock and roll, and dance styles. And Soul Train would emerge in the 1970s as an alternative to American Bandstand. Started by Don Cornelius, who was the host, he would showcase numerous bands and acts like Kool and the Gang, the Jackson 5, New Edition. And once again, we're coming back to this question. Does Don Cornelius have an obligation to address issues impacting his community, or can he just have a show that is about the music and never address any issues of politics and race? Another item that's in the framework is the Soul Train line. And the Soul Train line in a Google search, you get a group of people on this side, a group of people on this side, and one at a time you just go through the center of the line and you show your best move. This is the clip that is required. Will Smith would use the Soul Train line in his video Summertime. Plays and musicals. The play The Fences, which was a play that was also addressing what it's like to be African American in the United States. And so here we have August Wilson. So he's also dealing with the same issue. Can he make a play? Does he have to make a black play? And we looked at this with Langston Hughes, where he was bringing up this issue during the Harlem Renaissance and what it meant to be a black poet versus just a regular poet. Do you have an obligation? Seems to be the key question. Closure discussion points. We're going to come back to this slide here, and I've also added these 2 questions. And we're at the point of the course, we're going to start looking once again at the gift of Alvin White. And if we do not remember, Alvin White introduced the author Lawrence Hogan to a host of African American history contributors that the author Lawrence Hogan had no awareness of. So on this slideshow alone, there are numerous individuals that you've learned about and their contribution to American society and African American history. Additional closure questions. And at the end, you want to be able to define these terms. One that was not addressed fully was blackface, because we've addressed this in a prior class, but as I mentioned in this one, that is the process of white actors putting on black paint to portray black characters. If you want to check your definitions,